How you doing there? Welcome back to Babble on Talmud. Today we're studying Daf Pei, Daf 85 of Shechting Chullin, friends. Daf Pei. We're going to go Mishnah to Mishnah. The first Mishnah, we talk about Shechita she'eina re'uya. It's back. We learned about Shechita she'eina re'uya in the context of Oso v'ez beno. We are now going to learn about Shechita she'eina re'uya in the context of Kisui Adam. There is an interesting plot twist, which I found particularly interesting, and I hope that you will also find particularly interesting. And secondly, towards the end of the daf, we discuss shechting a bird for its blood. Of course, we know if you shecht a bird, you have to do kisui adam. What if you are shechting the bird because you need its blood for whatever reason? But what happens if you shecht it and you effectively can't really use the blood because you have to do kisui adam with the blood? So what do you do? What can you do? Friends, that is what we have in store for us on Daf Pei of Shechting Chullin. Come join me and let's enjoy learning Daf Pei of Shechting Chullin. Friends, we begin on Daf Pei Amud Aleph, about like half-ish away into the Amud, a little bit less, at the Mishnah. Ashoichet v'nimtzeis treife. Somebody who shechts an animal, turns out that the animal is treif, which makes that shechita is shechita she'eina re'uya, a shechita that does not result in being able to eat the animal. Or somebody who shechts an animal for idolatry. Chulin bifnim, somebody who takes chulin, who takes a animal that he would like to eat, and he takes it into the azar and shechts it there. Of course, that is asur ba'achila. V'kachim bachutz, or korbanos that are shechted outside of the azara, also pasul. Chaya va'of on his skolim, as well as a chaya, a deer, or a bird that need to be stoned because they killed somebody. Like we learned in the Mishnah Masechta Edius that we learned about on Daf Chov Zayin of Masechta Brachis, friends. Remember Daf Chov Zayin of Masechta Brachis? That was less than 4 weeks into Babble on Talmud. Can you imagine? Going all the way back, less than 4 weeks into Babble on Talmud. We're more than 6.5 years later now. Unbelievable. We learned about a chicken who was stoned for killing somebody, for pecking through a baby's skull. So yes, chickens can also be stoned for killing people. In all of these scenarios, right? So since a chaya or an oaf that need to be stoned because they killed people. So in all of the aforementioned scenarios, the meat of this animal or bird would be unedible. You wouldn't be allowed to eat it. It would be not kosher. So that means that the shechita memela was an unfit shechita. It's a shechita that did not result in kosher meat. So Meir Mechayiv, Meir says nonetheless, shechita she'eina re'uya shma shechita, and right for in the context of kisui adam, and kisui adam must be done. The Chachamim say shechita she'eina re'uya lo shmei shechita, and therefore you don't need to do kisui adam. Ashoichet v'nisnavla biyado. If one shechts, a few weeks, about a month, over a month ago, I went to a chicken shechita, and one of the birds, it was a pasul shechita, it was a nevela. So we say ashoichet v'nisnavla biyado. So we didn't have to do kisui adam for that bird. Ve'anocher ve'ma'aker, one who pierces and one who uproots the simonim, patur milchasos. In all of those scenarios where it is a the shechita itself is a problematic shechita, right? In the reish of the Mishnah, we're talking about scenarios where the shechita itself is technically a kosher shechita, right? It turns out there's a hole in the trachea or something, so it ends up being a treifa, but the shechita itself, if it wasn't a treifa, the shechita would be a good shechita. Whereas over here, there's an actual issue with the shechita itself, right? It was a nevela. So in those cases, patur milchasos. Everyone would agree, even Reb Meir would agree that there's no chiyuv of kisui adam because it's bechlal not even a shechita at all. It's nevela. Okay, I'm going to take a shluck of coffee and we'll go weiter. So now the Gemara asks a really interesting question. Amr B'chia bar Abba, or at least for now, an observation. Amr B'chia bar Abba, listen to this. Amr B'yechanan, Ra'a Rebbe Dvar Shor Reb Meir Ba'osov Es B'no V'shano B'lashon Chacham V'Reb Shimon B'Kisei Adam V'shano B'lashon Chacham. Very, 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 very interesting. Whoever was, maybe some of the Chavir at Babble and Talmud noticed something interesting. When it came to Oso V'es B'no, what did we say with regard to Shechita She'ena Re'uya? By Oso V'es B'no, we said that the Shita of Reb Shimon is that Shechita She'ena Re'uya Lo Shma Shechita, that a Shechita that does not result in kosher meat is not considered a Shechita, and therefore is not Shaykh for Oso V'es B'no. Whereas the Chachamim by Oso V'es B'no, they said that Shechita She'ena Re'uya Shma Shechita, and therefore Oso V'es B'no is Shaykh when, for example, if you shecht a treifa, even though it's Shechita She'ena Re'uya, the Chachamim say it would be considered Shechita nonetheless in the context of Oso V'es B'no. Reb Shimon says that it would not be considered Shechita. What do we see over here? By Kisui Adam, over here we see what's the Shita of the Chachamim? The Shita of the Chachamim is that Shechita She'ena Re'uya Lo Shma Shechita, and that if you shecht an animal and turns out that it's a treifa, right, a chaya or a bird, turns out it's a treifa. So Chacham by Kisei Adam, the Chachamim say Shechita She'ena Re'uya Lo Shma Shechita. You don't have to do Kisui Adam. Now that was the Shita of Reb Shimon, Shechita She'ena Re'uya Lo Shma Shechita, when it came to Oso V'es B'no. Over here, the Mishnah says it's the opinion of the Chachamim. And what about Shechita She'ena Re'uya Shma Shechita? The Mishnah is saying, that's just the opinion of Reb Meir. Whereas by Oso V'es B'no, we said that's the opinion of the Chachamim. So the Gemara says something very, very, very interesting in my opinion, which is, but what we see here is machlekes between Reb Meir and Reb Shimon. There's no Chachamim. There's machlekes Reb Meir and Reb Shimon. As we see that by Oso V'es B'no, Shechita She'ena Re'uya Lo Shma Shechita is the opinion of Reb Shimon, who apparently is arguing on the Chachamim there. And by Kisui Adam, the opinion of Shechita She'ena Re'uya Shma Shechita is the opinion of Reb Meir, which was the opinion of the Chachamim back by Oso V'es B'no. Here by Kisui Adam, it's the Shechita She'ena Re'uya Shma Shechita is the opinion of Reb Meir, who is apparently arguing on the Chachamim. So interestingly, apparently what we see is that by Oso V'es B'no, Rebbe was called, Rebbe, the editor of the Mishnayos, was referring to the Shita of Reb Meir, Shechita She'ena Re'uya Shma Shechita, as the opinion of the Chachamim. And when it comes to Kisui Adam, Rebbe is relating to the opinion of Reb Shimon, Shechita She'ena Re'uya Lo Shma Shechita, as the opinion of the Chachamim. How come? As we're going to see in the Gemara, and the Gemara is going to get into this now, essentially, when Rebbe was compiling the Mishnayos, and he needed to establish the halacha, he says, look, the halacha is when it comes to Oso V'es B'no, Shechita She'ena Re'uya Shma Shechita, which is the opinion of Reb Meir. Now, if he just has a machlekes in the Mishnayos between Reb Shimon and Reb Meir, so it's a machlekes between two Tanoim. Who do you hold like? Therefore, because Rebbe holds by Oso V'es B'no that the halacha, and he's compiling the Mishnayos for us, and he needs us to know what the halacha is by Oso V'es B'no, and the answer is Shechita She'ena Re'uya Shma Shechita. So by making Reb Meir's Shita the opinion of the Chachamim, well, that gives it a lot more weight. It's the Chachamim, it's the majority opinion. We're not going to hold like Reb Shimon against the Chachamim. And when it came to Kisui Adam, the opposite was true, as we're going to see in the Gemara. Rebbe concluded that we should hold like the Shita of Reb Shimon, that Shechita She'ena Re'uya Lo Shma Shechita by Kisui Adam. So instead of making a machlokes between Reb Meir and Reb Shimon, he referred to Reb Shimon's Shita as the Shita of the Chachamim. And the Chachamim say Shechita She'ena Re'uya Lo Shma Shechita when it comes to Kisui Adam. And now we're going to say, oh, okay, the Chacham, it's Reb Meir against the Chacham. Of course, we're passing with the Chacham. But the fact of the matter is, what we see here is that this is really just a machlokes between Reb Meir and Reb Shimon, which is fascinating because we see that, it's always an interesting question, like what exactly are the Chacham, who are the Chachamim? And we get a little bit of insight over here. Sometimes the Gemara says, like, Man Chacham, who are the Chacham? It's this Shita. What we see over here is that essentially Rebbe took just a single Shita, whether it's Reb Meir, whether it's Reb Shimon, and just amplified it as the Chacham so that we would hold it, so that we would paskin like the Chacham, like the majority opinion. But the fact of the matter is, it's just a device for Rebbe to kind of hold like one way in a particular machlokas. It's very interesting, right? So the Chacham isn't necessarily this whole group of Chacham, this whole group of people. It could just be that Rebbe refers to one particular shita in a machlokes as the Chachamim, so that we'll hold that way. Extremely, extremely, extremely interesting. So the Chacham doesn't necessarily have to be multiple people. It could just be one shita. Fascinating. My time to Reb Meir, both of us know enough. Now, we're going to get insight into how come Rebbe made these decisions in terms of who to give weight to. Let me have a little more coffee. So says the Gemara, my time up. The Reb Meir Bosov Esbeno. Why by Osov Esbeno does Reb Meir, which ends up being the sheet of the Chachamim, why by Osov Esbeno does Reb Meir say, Shechita she'ene ru'uya shma shechita? And Reb Shua ben Levi, Gomer shechita shechita mi shchutei chutz. Says Reb Shua Levi because it says shechita by Osov Esbeno, lo sishchatu beyom echad, lo sishchatu, and it says by shchutei chutz, right? Ishish mbez asher yishchat soror kezav oeiz b'machna or asher yishchat michutz hamachna. So it says shechita also by shchutei chutz. Ma hasam shechita she'ene ru'uya shma shechita. Just like over there, shechita she'ene ru'uya, which I assume it's shechita she'ene ru'uya because you're shechting kodshim b'chutz. So it's shechita it's apostle shechita, and we say, nonetheless, it's good enough for shchutei chutz, and you're going to be chayav for shchutei chutz. Afachanami shechita she'ene ru'uya shma shechita. So by Osov Esbeno as well, shechita she'ene ru'uya, for example, if you shecht a treifa, nonetheless it'll be considered shechita, and therefore Osov Esbeno is shaykh. You can't shecht a mother, the mother and the daughter on the same day, if even one of them was shechita she'ene ru'uya. Fine. Reb Shimon, my time up. How come by Osov Esbeno Reb Shimon says shechita she'ene ru'uya lo shma shechita? Reb Mani bar Patish Gomar mitvayach tevach vehochen. Yosef HaTzadik and his brothers, when they came back a second time, this time they brought their youngest brother Benjamin. So the pasuk says, I'll read you from the pasuk. It says, Vaya Yosef oisem es Binyamin. They saw, Yosef HaTzadik saw that they brought his younger brother Binyamin with them. Vayomer l'asher abeso, and he says to the people in his house, Ahove es anashim abayso, bring the people to our house, utvayach tevach v'hochen, and prepare slaughter meat. Ki tiochlu anoshim batzorem, because they're going to eat with me. So apparently, right, they shechted meat that was kosher. Right, as Joseph HaTzadik says, we're all going to eat meat together. So clearly, there must have been a kosher shechita. So when it says tvoach tevach v'ochin, so tvicha, and Reb Shimon is therefore saying that tvicha is essentially shechita. What does tvicha mean? Tvoach, to shecht, which is like shechita. Malol and shechita ru'uyot. So just like the shechita by Yosef HaTzadik was kosher shechita, because they're all going to be eating lunch together. Afkan shechita ru'uya. So here as well, by Osov Esbeno, we need it to be a kosher shechita, shechita she'ena ru'uya, lo shma shechita. V'Meir nami ligamer mitvoach. Why doesn't Reb Meir also learn like Reb Shimon, that it's kosher shechita from Yosef HaTzadik? Dann in shechita mi shechita, when dann in shechita mitvicha. I'll tell you why. Because what it says by Osov Esbeno is shechita, lo sishchatu. Doesn't say lo yitbichu, lo titbichu. It doesn't say that. It says lo sishchatu, shchita. So we have to learn shchita from another place where it says shchita. Don't bring me a raya from Yosef HaTzadik where it doesn't say shchita. It says tvicha, that's a different word. Vein dan shchita mit tvicha, ma nafke mine. To which Gemara says, why not? Who cares? Shchita, tvicha, same difference. I'll prove it to you. Hatanas Rabbi Shmuel, started the speech of Rabbi Shmuel, v'shava koin uva koin. Zoi shiva zoi bia. That they make a gzera shava using two completely different words. V'shav hakoin, uva hakoin. They make a gzera shava from shav and ba. So if they can make a gzera shava using two completely different words, so can we. And let's say that tvicha and shchita are essentially the same thing. They both refer to slaughtering, and therefore, just like by Yosef HaTzadik, by tvicha, it was kosher shchita, so also by Osav Esbino needs to be kosher shchita. So, and for Reb Meir, no. Hane mile, look, v'shava koin, uva koin is exceptional, because it only works, eicha deleko dedamile. That kind of a thing is only going to work V'shava koin, uva koin, shiva, bia, two completely different words. When there are no exact matches, so then non-exact matches are acceptable. Aval ika didamile midamile yalfinun. But says Reb Meir that if you have an exact match, like we do, shchita between Osav Esbino and shchutei chutz, we got to go with the exact match. We can't skip over an exact match for a non-exact match. Reb Shimon, nami legami shchutei chutz. Why doesn't Reb Shimon agree with Reb Meir? Why doesn't Reb Shimon hold shchita from shchutei chutz? Tanen chulin michulin medan chulin mikachim. Says Reb Shimon, I'll tell you why. Shchutei chutz is kachim. Osav Esbino is chulin, and therefore we need to learn Osav Esbino, which is chulin, from Yosef HaTzadik, which was also talking about chulin. They were shechting for lunch, not from shchutei chutz, which is korbanos. Reb Meir, to which Reb Meir responds, I don't know why you're saying that Osav Esbino is chulin. After all, Osav Esbino, we learned all about it. Could apply to kachim as well, right? In the context of Osav Esbino, we learned about all sorts of scenarios. Chulin b'chutz, chulin b'fnim, kachim b'chutz, kachim b'fnim. Osav Esbino, of course, also refers to kachim. It's a complicated sugya. So Reb Meir, atu Osav Esbino b'kachim milo noig. So Reb Meir responds to Reb Shimon, why are you saying that Osav Esbino is specifically chulin? It can also be kachim. Hainu de ka'amer m'chia divrei Rebbe divra. Whoa. Hainu de ka'amer m'chia ra'a Rebbe dvarav shel Meir b'Osav Esbino v'shano b'loshen Chachamim. That is precise. It says Reb Chia bar. Who is it? Reb Chia bar, the name of Rabbi Yochanan. That is why Reb Chia bar says in the name of Rabbi Yochanan that Rebbe sided with Reb Meir when it comes to Osav Esbino, because ultimately Rebbe felt that Reb Meir won that argument, that when Reb Shimon is basing his argument based on the fact that Osav Esbino is chulin, and Rebbe says it's not necessary, and Reb Meir says it's not necessarily chulin, so Rebbe felt that Reb Meir won that argument, and therefore he gave weight and gave preference to Reb Meir's opinion by Osav Esbino to say Shechita she'eina ru'uya shma shechita by Osav Esbino, and referred to Reb Meir's opinion as the opinion of the Chachamim. Once you refer to Reb Meir's opinion as the Chachamim's opinion, of course we're going to hold that way. My time with Reb Meir b'kisui adam. How come by kisui adam Reb Meir says Shechita she'eina ru'uya shma shechita? Reb Shimon ben Lakish says Rish Lakish gomer shvicha mishchutei chutz. Well, once again, he learns out kisui adam from shchutei chutz. That it says by kisui adam. Let me find the pasuk. There it is. V'yish mi bnei Yisrael u'minager gab bezochim sheyotzu tzed chaya of asher ochel v'shafach ezdam v'chizol be'ofer. By kisui adam it says v'shafach ezdam shvicha. And by shchutei chutz, it says dam shafach, right? Dam yechoshev la'ish ahu dam shafach. So it says shvicha by kisui adam, and it says shvicha by, once again, by shchutei chutz. And therefore, just like by shchutei chutz, we had said shchita she'eina ru'uya shma shchita, so also by kisui adam, Reb Meir says shchita she'eina ru'uya shma shchita. And if you shecht an animal that is a treifa, so even though it's shchita she'eina ru'uya, it's shchita and it requires kisui adam. So mala'olan shchita she'eina ru'uya shma shchita, afkan shchita she'eina ru'uya shma shchita. Reb Shimon, why does Reb Shimon say by kisui adam shchita she'eina ru'uya lo shma shchita? The answer is asher ochel ksiv, because by kisui adam, I'll read you the pasuk. V'ishish mibnei Yisrael min hager agar b'sochem asher yotzu tzeit chaya ha'ov asher yei ochel mishavach zam v'chizal be'ofer. That we're talking about a animal or a bird, a chaya or an oaf that you're going to eat. If it's shchita she'eina ru'uya, you can't eat it. Therefore, it's not shaykh to kisui adam. Reb Meir awulimutei of tameu de'asa. Says Reb Meir, look, when it says asher yei ochel, it's just saying that it has to be a kosher animal. A non-kosher animal you can't eat. So asher yei ochel is excluding non-kosher animals. Non-kosher chayas, non-kosher ofis. But in terms of if you have a kosher chay or a kosher oaf, and it just happens to be shchita she'eina ru'uya, if it's a treif or whatever, as long as it's a kosher chay of a oaf, you would have to do kisui adam. Reb Shimon responds, of tame my timer. Why are you excluding of tame? Why are you excluding a non-kosher bird? Why are you excluding a non-kosher bird from asher yei ochel? Tila barachilu. Because it says asher lo yei ochel. You can't eat a non-kosher bird. Treifa nami la barachilu. To which Reb Shimon says to Reb Meir, well, no. If you shecht an animal, shchita she'eina ru'uya, it's a treifa, for example, can't eat that either. It's also asher lo yei ochel. Therefore, any shchita she'eina ru'uya, lo shma shchita, when it comes to kisui adam, it has to be asher yei ochel. V'hainu da'amar Reb Chia Rebbe Dvar Reb Shimon b'kisui adam v'sheno b'lashon Chachamim. So that is why, says Reb Chia, that Rebbe sided with Reb Shimon when it comes to kisui adam, because Rebbe found that Reb Shimon had the stronger argument by kisui adam, which is, look, when it says asher lo yei ochel, asher yei ochel, that kisui adam applies to chayav ha'of that you're going to eat. So that means that anytime you're not going to eat it, whether that's because it's not kosher or whether it's because it's a treifa or some other shchita she'eina ru'uya, there's not going to be kisui hadam. So once again, Rebbe felt that Reb Meir won the argument by Osav Ezbino, that Reb Shimon won the argument by kisui adam. Rebbe wanted to paskin like Reb Meir by Osav Ezbino and like Reb Shimon by kisui adam. So to do that, he basically made their opinion the Chachamim's opinion, and by doing so, we're going to paskin like Reb Meir, i.e. the Chachamim, paskin like the Chachamim, i.e. Reb Meir, by Osav Ezbino, and we're going to paskin also like the Chachamim, but in this case it's Reb Shimon, by kisui hadam. Very, very interesting Gemara, in my opinion, right, with a little of a peek behind the curtain into the workings of Rebbe and the editing of the Mishnayos about what exactly does it mean when we see the sheet of the Chachamim. Sure, it could be the Chachamim, right? You could have, let's say, Machlekes Rabbi Yehuda and the Chachamim. The Chachamim in that case could be a combination of Reb Shimon and Reb Meir and Reb Yossi, etc., the Chachamim. But it could also simply be Rebbe taking a position in a Machlokes between two Tanoim. Very, very fascinating, in my opinion. The Gemara now continues to explore the shitas of Reb Meir and Reb Shimon, of Shechita she'eina ru'uya shma shechita and Shechita she'eina ru'uya lo shma shechita, respectively. Amar Abba, says Reb Abba, lo lakol Amar Reb Meir Shechita she'eina ru'uya shma shechita. Says Reb Abba that when Reb Meir says Shechita she'eina ru'uya shma shechita, it is not universal. There's an exception. Moder Reb Meir, shein matirosa ba'achila. Interesting. Says Babble. After all, Reb Meir admits and agrees that when you have Shechita she'eina re'uya, it's not considered Shechita to the extent you're not allowed to eat it. Right? For example, you shech the treifa. So of course it's Shechita she'eina re'uya. So are we going to say Shechita she'eina re'uya, shma Shechita, now you can eat treifa? No, you can't eat treifas. The Gemara is going to say, well, that's obvious. Obviously you can't eat treif. Yeah, okay. Say it, but says the Gemara, you don't apply Shechita she'eina re'uya, shma Shechita, to allow you to eat treifa. Okay. And also, Reb Shimon, when he says Shechita she'eina re'uya lo shma Shechita, it's also not universal. Reb Shimon because after all, Reb Shimon does agree that if you have Shechita she'eina re'uya, for example, you shecht a treifa, so you might think Shechita she'eina re'uya lo shma Shechita, and therefore if it's not Shechita, it's nevela, and it's metame, avatuma. No, Reb Shimon says Shechita she'eina re'uya, even though we say lo shmei Shechita, it will be able to be metayer so that it won't be nevela. So if you shecht an animal, it's a treifa. Even though it's Shechita she'eina re'uya, it won't be nevela, it will be tehora. Although we learned in one of the previous prakim, maybe Behema Makasha, that it would still be treifa shchuta is still metame kodshim, but anyways, it's not nevela, that's for sure. Amar Mar, we said earlier, we just said lo l'chol Amar Reb Meir Shechita she'eina re'uya shma Shechita, that when Reb Meir says Shechita she'eina re'uya shma Shechita, it is not universal, because after all Moder Reb Meir she'ein matirosa ba'achila. After all, Reb Meir says that by Shechita she'eina re'uya, for example, if you shecht an animal, a treifa, even though it says Shechita she'eina re'uya shma Shechita, you still can't eat it. Pshita, obviously you can't eat it. Treifa, b'shechita mimishtaya, I don't understand. If you have an animal that's a treifa, just because you shecht it, the most beautiful Shechita in the world, it's still a treifa. Of course you can't eat it. Lo tzricha l'shoichet es a treifa u'motza ba ben tisha chai. It takes us back to Perik Behema Mikasha. Givaldik, beautiful Mishnayos and Gemara, that if a person shechts a animal, and after Shechita, after they shecht the animal, they open up the animal and they see a ben tisha chai, that there is a full-term fetus inside of that shechted animal, a 9-month fetus, and it's alive. So I might think, so now here's the kicker though. The kicker is that the mother turned out to be treif. That's the kicker. So you shecht the mother, you find inside a ben tisha chai, but the mother's treif. So on the one hand, you might think, well, if we say Shechita she'eina re'uya shma Shechita, according to Reb Meir, so the mother's Shechita she'eina re'uya, it's a treifa, you can't eat it. According to Reb Meir, Shechita she'eina re'uya shma Shechita. So if that's the case, if it's a proper Shechita, so I can't eat the mother because it's treif, but maybe it'll work for the ben tisha chai. Maybe you don't need to shecht the ben tisha chai, right? Because after all, if you shecht the mother, the Shechita works for the ben tisha chai as well. So we say no, there's a limitation there. Shechita she'eina re'uya, even though we say Shechita she'eina re'uya shma Shechita, it's not going to allow you to eat the ben tisha chai. I may have thought, Hoyel de Amr Reb Meir, since Reb Meir says Shechita she'eina re'uya shma Shechita, that Shechita she'eina re'uya is a kosher Shechita. Tehanile Shechitas imo, maybe the Shechita of the mother, even though it's a treifa, would work for the Shechita, and you wouldn't have to shecht the ben tisha chai, since you shechted the mother, even though the mother's a treifa, but Shechita she'eina re'uya shma Shechita, kamash malon. So therefore, what we're learning is that no, there's a limitation to Shechita she'eina re'uya shma Shechita. In this case, we will not allow you to eat the ben tisha chai without first shechting it v'tizbura. But fact, the Gemara, an amazing question. I'm sure many of us here at Babble on Talmud were wondering. But isn't Reb Meir's shita, when it comes to behema mikasha, that if you shecht an animal and you find that there's a ben tisha chai inside of it, even if the animal, the mother is kosher, you would still need to shecht the ben tishachai. That's simply the shita of Reb Meir. Reb Meir simply holds that if you shecht the mother, and it's a kosher shechita, and you find inside a ben tishachai, you have to shecht the ben tishachai separately. So therefore, to come here and say that when Reb Meir says shechita she'eina ruya shmei shechita, it doesn't apply to a ben tishachai. Of course, it doesn't apply to a ben tishachai. That's simply Reb Meir shita always. It never applies to ben tishachai. But Reb Meir says ben pakua to own shechita, that a ben tishachai requires its own shechita anyways. Lo tzricha the Rebbe savala Reb Meir v'savala Rabbanon. So once again, we have to look at how Rebbe paskins in the different contexts. You see, when it comes to the ben tishachai, Rebbe in the Mishnayos, Rebbe quoted Reb Meir shita as Reb Meir shita, but he also quotes the shitas Chachamim in that Mishnah. Reb Meir's shita is that when you find the ben tishachai, you have to shecht it separately. But the Chachamim shita in that Mishnah is that the shechita of the mother allows you to eat the ben tishachai without shechita. So Rebbe paskins when it comes to ben pakua, when it comes to the ben tishachai, Rebbe paskins like the Chachamim in that Mishnah, which is that the shechita of the mother works for the ben tishachai, and you don't need to shech the ben tishachai. Rebbe also says when it comes to oso v'ezbino, he makes Reb Meir's opinion, the opinion of the Chachamim, that shechita she'eina ruya shma shechita when it comes to oso v'ezbino. Therefore, if we take a look at the way that Rebbe paskins in those two scenarios, in those two contexts, you might be able to piece together a story that Rebbe would say that when you shecht a mother and you find inside a ben tishachai, even if the mother is treifa, maybe we would say that Rebbe's opinion would be that shechita she'eina ruya shma shechita, like Rebbe says by oso v'ezbino, passings like Reb Meir, that shechita she'eina ruya shma shechita. And therefore I might think that when it comes to ben pakua, when it comes to ben tishachai, where he paskins that when you shecht the mother, it works for the ben tishachai as well. Maybe that is even if the mother's a treifa, because shechita she'eina ruya shma shechita, and it's a proper shechita, and it would work for the ben tishachai as well. No, there's a limitation to shechita she'eina ruya shma shechita, and we would say that it would not apply to when the mother is a treifa, and even Rebbe would say that you would have to shecht the ben tishachai separately, because there's a limitation to shechita she'eina ruya shma shechita. Savala Reb Meir do Amar shechita she'eina ruya shma shechita. Rebbe paskins like Reb Meir by oso v'ezbino, in the context of oso v'ezbino, that shechita she'eina ruya shma shechita, and in the context of ben pakua by behema makasha v'savala Rabbanon da'amri shchitas imo mitaraso, that the shechita of the mother allows you to eat the ben tishachai even without shechita. So kevan da'amri Rabbanon shchitas imo mitaraso, and therefore, since Rebbe paskins by ben pakua that the shechita of the mother is going to allow you to eat the ben tishachai without shechita, tani le shchitas imo v'lo liba shechita. So let's say that the shechita of the mother, even though she's a treifa, no big deal, shechita she'eina ruya shma shechita, and it would work. It'd be mitayar the ben tishachai, would not need shechita. Kamaj malan. Therefore, what Reb Chia is teaching us is that there's a limit to shechita she'eina ruya shma shechita. It would not apply to that case, and the ben tishachai, when the mother's a treifa, the ben tishachai would require its own shechita. Okay, givaldi. So Reb Chia came and says that when Reb Meir says shechita she'eina ruya shma shechita, there is a limitation, and that is when there is a ben tishachai and the mother is a treifa, you would have to shech the ben tishachai separately. We can't rely upon the shechita of the mother. Okay, I'm going to chap a shluck of coffee, and we'll go weiter. And now, says the Gemara, with regard to Reb Shimon's shita, v'lalakol amar Reb Shimon, shechita she'eina ruya lo shma shechita. And when Reb Shimon says shechita she'eina ruya is not a proper shechita, it's not. There is a limitation. There is a scenario where he would say, even though it's Shechita She'eina Re'uya, it is considered a Shechita. What was that scenario? We said, if you shecht an animal and it's a treifa, so you might think Shechita She'eina Re'uya, lo shma Shechita, it's not a Shechita at all, it's a nevela. No, Reb Shimon would say it's Shechita at least to the extent that it won't be nevela. Well, that's obvious. We don't need Reb Chia to tell me about that, because after all, the Amr reviewed Amr Rab, Amr Rab Masnisa Tana, min abeima. That in the context of nevela, the pasuk says v'chiyamus min abeima. When dies from the beima, what does that mean? Mixas beima mitama, mixas beima eina mitama. When it comes to nevela, there are some animals that when they die, they will be nevela, but there are others that when they die, won't be nevela. Ve'ezo, what's an example? What is this animal that when it dies, it is not nevela? Zo treifa sheshachata. So we learn from, whether it's Rav Yehuda Marav or maybe even a Braisa, that we learn from a pasuk that when you shecht an animal and it is treif, it is not nevela, right? If you do a proper shechita on an animal, turns out it's a treifa, it is not nevela, it's tahor. So, okay, that seems to be learned from a pasuk. So of course, Reb Shimon is going to agree that when we say Shechita She'eina Re'uya, lo shma Shechita, that does not mean that if it's a treifa, it's going to be nevela. It's going to be tahor. So what we need this, what Reb Chia is teaching us is, the shochet is a treifa v'chulin ba'azar. Amazing. Unbelievable. So what Reb Chia is teaching us is that when Reb Shimon says Shechita She'eina Re'uya, lo shma Shechita, there is a limitation, and that limitation is, if you take a sheep into the azar, the sheep is not a korban. The sheep is chulin. It has never been sanctified, and you shecht chulin in the azar. Now, as we learned in what's the last parak, that chulin shenishchatu bazar is posel shchita. Yeah, probably last parak. That chulin shenishchatu bazar is posel shchita. Shechita She'eina Re'uya. Now, what does Reb Shimon say about chulin shenishchatu bazar? The Tanya Ashoichet is a treifa. V'chein Ashoichet v'nimtze is treifa. Zevaz a chulin bazar. That says, right, so Reb Shimon matir ba'anov v'chacham osin. So it says Reb Shimon that if you take a animal into the azar and shecht it in the azar. Now the halacha is, when it comes to chulin ba'azar, that it's asur ba'ano. Then when it comes to chulin ba'azar, it's asur ba'ano. If you just take a chulin sheep and bring it into the azar and shecht it there, it's asur ba'ano. However, says Reb Shimon that if you take a treifa into the azar and shecht it there, what's an example of that? For example, it's missing its back leg. You can see it's visibly a treifa. Alternatively, you shecht an animal in the azar and you check its lungs and it's got a puncture in there, it's got a hole in there, so it turns out it's a treifa. Either way, we're talking about an animal that's a treifa. So if you shecht chulin in the azar and it's treif, says Reb Shimon, it's mutter ba'ano. So chulin ba'azar is generally asur ba'ano. Reb Shimon's shita, however, is that if you shecht chulin ba'azar and it turns out that it's treif, it's mutter ba'ano. Why is that? As Rashi says, because the pasuk says, Ki yirchak mimcha makom etc. v'zavachta berichuk makom ata zavech. This is what Rashi says. So Rashi says that it's learned from a pasuk in the Torah. And the pasuk says that you is v'zavachta, that you shecht, they do shechita. Ki yirchak mimcha. If you want to shecht chulin, you do it outside of azar. You're not checking chulin in the azar. Ki yirchak mimcha makom. When you're far away, which essentially means anywhere outside the azar, that's where you shecht chulin. You don't shecht chulin in the azar. So the isser of shechting chulin in the azara is an isser midaraisa. However, it says there v'zavachta, that it has to be proper shechita, and if it's a treifa, So it's not proper shechita. So we say when it comes to chulin ba'azara, it's asur ba'ano. Chulin ba'azara is asur ba'ano. But, says Reb Shimon, shechita she'eina ruya lo shma shechita. That since it's a treifa, it's not a proper shechita. And since it's not a proper shechita, so therefore, it's not asur ba'ano, it's mutar ba'ano. So says Reb Shimon, so again, Hashorchel is a treifa. If a person checks a treifa, v'chin hashorchel v'nimtze is treifa. If you shecht an animal, turns out it's a treifa. Zeh v'zeh. Either way, chulin bazar. If we're talking about chulin bazar, Reb Shimon matar bano. Reb Shimon says mutar bano because since it's a treifa, it's shechita she'eina re'uya. Since it's shechita she'eina re'uya, it doesn't apply to chulin shnishchtu bazar where it says v'zavachtam. This isn't v'zavachta. It's mutar bano. Chamos and Chum say it's also bano. But sakadatecha amina, I may have thought, oh, Reb Shimon mutar bano. Since Reb Shimon says it's mutar bano, why does he say it's mutar bano? Because it's shechita she'eina re'uya, and therefore lo shma shechita, and therefore even though chulin shnishchtu bazar is also bano, this is mutar bano because it's shechita she'eina re'uya. Al molav shechita hi klal. So I might say, okay, so it's not a shechita at all. And that's why it's mutar bano. So ima midei nevela nami lo mitara. Well, if it's not shechita at all, then isn't it nevela? And therefore, maybe Reb Shimon would also say that it is tameh. It's nevela. So Kamash Malon, what Reb Abba is teaching us is that there's a limit to Reb Shimon's shita when he says shechita she'eina re'uya lo shma shechita. It is, however, shechita to the extent that this scenario of chulin bazar that turns out to be a treifa or is a treifa and is mutar ba'ano, it is nonetheless not in nevela. It is tahor. It is not nevela. It's not tameh. It is nonetheless tahor because there is a limit to shechita she'eina re'uya lo shma shechita. Givaldik. So Reb Abba had said that there is a limit to Reb Meir's shita of shechita she'eina re'uya shma shechita, and that there's a limit to Reb Shimon's shita of shechita she'eina re'uya lo shma shechita, and we just explained why that teaching of Reb Chia is important. Now, Amalei Rav Papa le'Abaye, Rav Papa asks a kasha to Abaye. V'sav Reb Shimon chulin bazar de'oraisi. Does Reb Shimon in fact hold, like we explained, that chulin shenishchutu bazar is a din de'oraisa from berichuk makom ata zoveach of ki yirchak mimcha makom v'zavachta from that pasuk? What's the alternative? The alternative is that Reb Shimon holds that the isser of chulin bazar is an isser derabanan. What would be the isser derabanan? Well, simply, it can't be that you take your own sheep that's chulin into the azara and shecht it and all good. Like it could be that midoraisa there isn't actually any isser against chulin bazar. It could be that midoraisa there isn't technically anything wrong with taking your own sheep into the azar and shechting it there. But there's a concern. What's the concern? The concern is that if we see people taking meat out of the azara and eating it outside of the azara, there's no way to know that that animal was chulin. It's reasonable to conclude that that animal was kachim. And it seems to be that it's completely okay to take kachim out of the azara and eat it outside the azara, which would particularly be an issue by kachim, or even if you're taking it out, let's stick with that. Meat that needs to be eaten in the azara, taking it out of the azara and eating it. So people might conclude that maybe even kachim can be eaten outside of the azara. So therefore, you could say that there's a din derabanan that maybe midoraisa it's okay to eat chulin shnishchtu ba'azara, but out of concern that people might conclude that even kachim can be eaten outside of the azara, so therefore they made a gezerah not to eat chulin outside of the azara either. Maybe that's the din derabanan. So Reb Shimon chulin ba'azara de'oraisi, right? Does Reb Shimon really say that chulin shnishchtu ba'azara is an isser de'oraisa? Maybe it's derabanan. Amalei in. Abaye says yes. In fact, Reb Shimon says that chulin shenishchtu bazar is an isser d'oraisa, and I'll prove it to you from a Mishnah. Vatnam, we learn in a Mishnah, Masechta Temura. Who's looking forward to Masechta Temura? We'll be there in about 6 months. 2, 4, 5, about 6 months we'll be in Masechta Temura. Who's excited for that? Vatnam, Reb Shimon says, Reb Shimon chulin shenishchtu bazar yisarfu ba'esh. says Reb Shimon, chulin shenishchatu ba'azara need to be burned in fire. V'chein chaya shenishchatu ba'azara, and Reb Shimon says that the same applies to a chaya shenishchatu ba'azara. That's Abaye's proof. How is it a proof? I'll tell you how it's a proof. I'll start by explaining, even though the Gemara first explains the D'oraisa side of it, I'll start by explaining the D'Rabbanan side of it, that this would not make sense if it's in the D'Rabbanan. How come? Well, if we're saying that Mida Oraisa, there's nothing wrong, technically Mida Oraisa, with Chulin Shenishchatu Ba'azar, so the Chacham made a Gzer. What's the Gzer? The Gzer is that, well, if you're allowed to shecht a behema in the azara, well, if you take the behema out of the azara and start eating it, so then there's no distinction between this sheep that's chulin versus a sheep that's kodesh. You take it outside the azara, people can reasonably conclude that, that's a korban and it's being eaten outside of the azara. And they could think that you're allowed to eat korbanos outside the azara. Right, I understand why you'd make that gezerah by behemoths that could be mistaken for a korban. The thing is, that would only make sense by behemoths to make that gezerah by a behemoth, where that could be reasonably confused for a korban. But there would be no reason to extend that gezerah to chayas as well. There are no korbanos that are chayas. If you're going to then extend that to chaya, the only way to explain that would be, well, we're making gezerah by a chaya, even though they can't actually be korbanos, they won't reasonably be confused for korbanos, but nonetheless we make a gezerah by a chaya just so that you shouldn't end up eating chulin ba'azara outside of the azara by a behema, which in itself is only a gezerah, so that you shouldn't eat kodesh outside of the azara. So it's a double removed gezerah. So if we say, so we just saw a Mishnah where Reb Shimon says not only do you have to burn behemoths shenishchatu ba'azara, but also chayas shenishchatu ba'azara. Now, if we're saying that this is all d'Rabbanan, it would not make sense to extend that to chayas, because the gzeira d'Rabbanan by a chaya would only be to prevent, so that you don't violate the gzeira d'Rabbanan by behemoths, which are only so that you don't end up eating kodesh b'chutz. So it's gzeira l'gzeira. It's a twice removed gzeira. So it wouldn't make sense, this Mishnah wouldn't make sense if we say that Reb Shimon holds that the Isser of Chulin Shenishchatu Ba'azara is Midrabanan. If you say it's D'oraisa, however, okay, now it makes sense. The Torah says that any Chulin Ba'azara is also Midrabanan. You're not allowed to eat it, and that is that. So now says the Gemara, Bishlomit D'oraisa. So I understand if we say that Reb Shimon holds that Chulin Shenishchatu Ba'azara is an Isser D'oraisa, Hanantik Azrinan Chaya Otu Behema. So the Gemara says Digaz. That's why I wanted to explain it outside first, because it's not, meaning it would only make sense if that's how you can explain why the Isser applies not just to Behema but to Chaya as well, because it's all Mida Oraisa. Ela'i Omrat D'Rabbanan. But if you say it's a din d'Rabbanan, so behema my timer. So, well, if it's d'Rabbanan, why are you not allowed to eat a behema outside of the azar? Because you might end up eating a korban b'chutz, right? You see a person eating a sheep outside of the azar. So it's reasonable to think that it's a korban, because a sheep could be a korban. So make a gezerah by behemas, so you don't end up eating korbanos b'chutz. But he gufa gezerah, if the reason why we don't eat behemas outside the azar is itself a gezer, so you don't eat korbanos outside the azar, and now you're going to say, now you can't eat chayas outside the azar, so you don't end up eating behemoths outside the azar, so you don't need to end up eating kachim outside the azar. He gufa gezer, behemoths themselves are gezer, v'anekum v'negzor, gezer l'gezer. Are we going to make an additional gezer by chayas, so you don't violate the other gezer by behemoths, so that you don't violate kachim b'chutz? That's a gezer l'gezer. We wouldn't make a gezer l'gezer, a double removed gezerah, and therefore from the fact that Reb Shimon says that you have to burn not just behema, the behema that's chulin shenishchatu ba'azar, but also a chaya that was nishchatu ba'azar. So that is a clear indication that Reb Shimon holds Now, when it comes to chulin shenishchtu bazar, it is an isur de oraisa, not an isur de rabbanan, not a gzera de rabbanan. And now the Gemara discusses the question of what if you shecht a bird or imagine an animal and you really just need its blood. For whatever reason, you need its blood, and it's going to do that within the context of an interesting Maisa Shahaya, an interesting story with Reb Chia and Rebbe, and the Gemara will conclude with what is, in my opinion, some very interesting stuff. So here we go. Says the Gemara, Reb Chia nafole yaneva be kitone. Reb Chia had a moth in his flax. Nobody wants moth in flax. It eats flax. Also, the Chachamim the Rebbe. So Reb Chia came to his Rebbe for advice. Amalei Rebbe says, Shkol ofa, take a bird, ushchot al bubisa demaya, and shecht the bird over the water that the flax is soaking in, demorach dama, because the moth will smell, will shmef, shmek, shmef, shmek, shmek, shmef, I think. Let's go with shmef. Because the moth will shmef the blood, vishavikle, and it'll say, I don't want anything to do with this, and the moths will leave your bloody flax alone. How could it be that Rebbe advised Reb Chia to shecht a bird so that its blood will bloody the flax soaking solution? We learn that if a person shechts because he needs the blood, he has to do kisei adam. So what do you do? Right? We saw, for example, there is a use case where you need blood. If you have moths eating your flax, but how are you going to get that blood? Because when you shecht the bird or the chaya, well, in this case, the recommendation was a bird. So when you shecht the bird, you're going to have to do kisei adam with that blood. You can't use it for your flax. You have to use it for kisei adam. So what do you do? So o nocharo o okro. What you can do is either you can, instead of doing a proper shechita, you can either pierce its simanim or uproot, tear out its simanim, but don't do a proper shechita. And since it is not a proper shechita, it's an improper shechita, so then there's no requirement for kisei adam, and you can allow that blood to drip into the flax solution. Kiyosar of Dimi, Omrit say trof Amrle. So what was the question? The question was, how could Rebbe's advice have been to shecht a bird and use its blood in the flax solution? That blood needs to be kisei adam. The solution would be, as we saw in a brisa, to pierce the simanim or tear them out, but Rebbe didn't say that. Rebbe had said, Shkol ofa ushchot al bubisa demaya. He said to shecht it. So, Kiyosar of Dimi, when Rav Dimi came from Eretz Yisrael to Babble, Omar, say trof, Omar le. Rebbe's advice was, in fact, to first make the bird a treifa, and once it's a treifa, then you could shecht it, and it'll be shechita sheni ruya, and there won't be any kisei adam required. So, Kiyosar, when Ravin came from Eretz Yisrael to Babble, Omar, he says, say nechor, Omar le. That Ravin says that Rebbe's advice was to pierce the simanim rather than do a proper shechita, and by doing so, again, there will be no chiyuv of kisei adam. So the Mando might say trof, according to Rav Dimi, who says that Rebbe's advice was to make it first a treifa. My time Amar say nechor. Why did Rav Dimi not say that the advice was to pierce the simanim? If you're going to say because Rebbe holds that shechting a bird is not midoraise, and since it's not midoraise, it doesn't require a proper shechita to be considered shechita. All of the halachas, the halacha l'Moshe Messinas regarding shechita are irrelevant for a bird in that case, and it could be considered shechita even just by piercing, for example. And if that's the case, that birds do not midoraisa require shechita, so simply piercing it can be considered like the shechita, and therefore it would require kisui adam. V'atanya, Rebbe Omer says, Rebbe, kasher tzivi sicha, that when the pasuk says, right, when the Rabbanu Shalom says to Moshe Rabbeinu, I'll read you the pasuk, ki yirchak mimcha amakom, hashivcha Hashem l'kecha, los mishmoshom v'zavachto, mibikarchu mitzoncha asher nosan Hashem l'kecha, kasher tzivi sicha, that you'll shecht like the Rabbanu Shalom commanded Moshe Rabbeinu. Where in the Torah does it talk about the Hilchos Shechita? So Mlamachin it's Stav and Moshe, that was Halacha Moshe Misinai. The Eibishter commanded Moshe Rabbeinu ala veshet v'ala koneh, about shechting the trachea and the esophagus, v'al rov echad ba'of, and that by a bird you only have to shecht to the majority of one of the simanim, not both. That by Behem you have to shecht to both. So we see that according, this is Rabbi Tana, Rebbe Omer. We see that Rebbe held that is Halacha Moshe Misinai about the Shechita of birds. So Rebbe agrees that birds you have to shecht midoraisa. So therefore, again, why, according to Rav Dimi, did Rebbe Davka say to make the bird a treifa first? Why couldn't he have said pierce the siman, and that would be an improper shechita lo mibaya kama? The answer is what Rav Dimi is saying. Yeah, of course, Rebbe could have said pierce the esophagus, pierce the simanim. Of course, he could have said that. But Rav Dimi is saying that we're saying something additional here by saying make it a treifa first. Lo mibaya say nechor dilav shechita klal. Of course, if you pierce the simanim, which isn't a shechita b'chlal, there will be no chiyuv for kisi adam. Aval say trof, a mashchita sheneruya shmashchita. But I might think that if you make it a treifa first, so that's a shechita, and then shecht it, so it'll be shechita sheneruya. And maybe we would say shechita sheneruya shmashchita, and it would require kisi adam. V'libai kisu kamash mlon kidur b'chiyah ba'aba. So therefore, what Rav Dimi is saying is that not only, of course, would Reb Chia have been able to simply pierce the simanim, and there would be no requirement for kisi adam, but he could even first make it a treifa, and then shecht it, and still there would be no requirement of kisi adam, since it's shechita sheneruya, since it's treif, and shechita sheneruya lo shma shechita. When it comes to kisi adam, there's no requirement for kisi adam there either. V'l'man da'omer tzei nechor, my time l'omer tzei trof. And according to Ravin, who says that Rebbe's advice was to pierce the simanim, why did he not say that the advice was to make it a treifa? And if you're going to tell me that it's because, in fact, Rebbe holds that shechita she'eina re'uya shma shechita is a proper shechita and it would require kisi adam, therefore that's not an option. Rebbe Tvav Shimon bekisi adam v'shano b'loshen Chachamim. But Rebbe Chia says the name of Rabbi Yochanan that when it comes to kisi adam, Rebbe holds like Reb Shimon that shechita she'eina re'uya lo shma shechita, and therefore if it's a treifa, it would be shechita she'eina re'uya, and it would not require kisui adam. So mibaya ka'amar. Well, Ravin is also saying a lo mibaya ka'avin. Of course, when it comes to if you would make it a treifa first, there would be no requirement of kisui adam. Lo mibaya say trof the shechita she'eina re'uya lo shma shechita. Of course, when it comes, if you would make it a treifa, there would be no requirement of kisui adam because shechita she'eina re'uya. And when it comes to kisui adam, Rebbe passes like Reb Shimon that shechita she'eina re'uya lo shma shechita. Of course, there's no kisui adam aval. Say nechor, but in the event, if you go and pierce it, ema ein shechita la'of min haTorah, maybe I might think that ein shechita la'of min haTorah v'nechiraso zoi shechita also, and piercing it would require shechita kisui adam because it would be a proper shechita. V'libai kisui, and it could require kisui adam. Kamashmon kasher tzivisicha. No. Of course, Rebbe holds that kasher tzivisicha means that there's a halacha Moshe Misinai that birds also require a proper shechita, and therefore piercing the simanim would not be a proper shechita, and there would be no requirement for kisur adam there either. Amazing. Now I'm just going to take a final shlick of coffee, even though there's basically nothing left, and we're going to have a look at the final piece of the Gemara, which is awesome. And here we go. Umi nafa le yaneva be kitone. Is this really a true story? Is this really a believable story? Who's going to believe that a moth was eating Reb Chia's flax? Who is going to believe that? Ve'amar Ravin bar Abba, ve'amar lo Amar Reb Avin bar Shva, Misha Alu b'nei Agoyla. From when the people of Babble made Aliyah to Eretz Yisrael, Pasku azikin va'azvos va'ruchos va'ra'amim. The meteors, okay, and the earthquakes and the violent winds and the thunders, they stopped. What else happened? And their wine stopped becoming vinegar. And their flax stopped getting ruined, I guess, including with moths. And who are these people that came from Babel and made Aliyah to Eretz Yisrael, and all these fortuitous things began to happen? It's when Reb Chia and his children made Aliyah to Eretz Yisrael. So how could it be that there were moths, that Reb Chia was struggling with moths in his flax such that he had to go to Rebbe for advice? How could that be? I thought that when Reb Chia moved to Eretz Yisrael, a whole bunch of things got fixed, including issues with the flax. So, and for the Gemara, listen to this, friends. Ki mahanya zchusayu alma adidu lo. Wow. That when there's chus, that when Reb Chia made Aliyah from Babel to Eretz Yisrael, and all of these fortuitous things happened, it happened generally for other people, but not necessarily for them. Kid Rav Yehuda, Amrav, like Rav Yehuda, Amrav, Amrav Yehuda, Amrav, b'chol yom vayom basko yotzes ve'omeres. That every single day a voice emanates from the heavens and says, Kol ha'olam kulo nizom b'shvil chanina b'ni, that the entire world is sustained because of the holy, holy, holy Reb Chanina ben Dosa. V'chanina b'ni, Reb Chanina ben Dosa, it's not like he's living it up. Fakert, dailo b'kav charuvin, me'ev Shabbos le'ev Shabbos. All he has is a kav, a little bit, right? We know what a kav is now. A kav is 4 loaves. Each log is 6 eggs worth. So a kav is 24 eggs worth of carob. Not a lot of eggs worth of carob. That's his food for the week. The whole world is thriving and everything. Everybody's having a great time, living it up. This Chus Reb Chanina ben Dosa, who we've seen all sorts of stories about how poor they were. They didn't have money for, even to light candles with oil, right? There's all sorts of descriptions of how poor they were, and yet the whole world is sustained by them. And we see this sometimes, right? You have these holy people, these special people who are able to give brachas and able to create merit for other people, and yet they struggle with some basic things themselves. Unbelievable, very interesting. So that is how we explain the phenomenon that Reb Chia could have been struggling with a moth infestation in his flax, and while that being one of the things that he himself helped solve, and yet while his chus was able to solve this problem for the others, he himself was actually still struggling with it. Very, very fascinating, friends. That was Daf Pei, Daf 85 of Masechta Chullin. On Daf Pei, Daf 85 of Masechta Chullin, we learned about Shechita she'ena re'uya in the context of Kisur Adam. Of course, we learned about Shechita she'ena re'uya in the context of Oso ves Beno. It is back now by Kisur Adam. And what is fascinating about this instance of Shechita she'ena re'uya is that we actually see a reversal of the of Rebbe's position in the Mishnayos, whereas by Oso ves Beno, the opinion of the Chachamim was Shechita she'ena re'uya shma Shechita. When it comes to Kisui Adam, the opinion of the Chacham, Shechita Shein Ruya Lo Shma Shechita, i.e., that by also as Bino, the opinion of the Chacham is essentially the opinion of Reb Meir, and that by Kisui Adam, the opinion of the Chacham is the opinion of Reb Shimon, and we talked about in the Gemara how essentially Rebbe amplified, right, that really the machlokas is not a machlokas Reb Meir and the Chacham or Reb Shimon the Chacham, it's really a machlokas between Reb Shimon and Reb Meir, and that Rebbe was giving weight to one of the opinions by calling it the Chacham, which is extremely fascinating because it gives us a little bit of a view behind the curtains of what exactly it means when we see the opinion of the Chachamim in Mishnayos, which is fascinating. And then we discussed shechting a bird for its blood, that when you shecht a bird for its blood, you nonetheless need to do Kisui Adam. So then how can you get around so what do you do if you actually need the blood? How do you get around having to do Kisui Adam? Well, you can. We saw, for example, we saw a story with Rebbe and Reb Chia where he said shecht a bird, and Reb Dimi said really what he suggested was to make it a treifa first and then shecht it. Ravin said that what he really suggested was to pierce the simanim, either way, to not do a proper shechita, and that way to be able to use the blood without the requirement of Kisui Adam. We then ended the daf with a fascinating quotation of what we've seen before is Reb Chanina ben Dosa, how the whole world was sustained in his merit, and yet he had the most basics of the basics. And we use that to explain how Reb Chia could have possibly been experiencing moths in his flax if, after all, once he made Aliyah from Babble to Eretz Yisrael, he's the one who solved the issue with the flax. And we explained that even though he solved it for the others, he himself struggled with it nonetheless. Friends, that was Daf 85 in Masechta Chullin. I hope you enjoy. Have a great Shabbos. Cheers.